Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
Tom, I want to start off today with a little mea culpa.
Yeah.
We talk all the time, sort of the Aristotelian theory of man is not perfect, right? Man is certainly imperfect, and we do our best. Actually went back and did a little research after some comments after last week's podcast, and I made a mistake, and I want to address it because, Dave. I mean, heaven forbid,
we thought
right?
You were perfect. Come on.
I mean, look, the best part about it is I'm willing to admit it when I made the mistake.
Sure.
Right? So last week I talked about Ronald Reagan's Time for Choosing speech, which I will still argue, and I will always argue, is one of the greatest political speeches we've had since Abraham Lincoln, and I stand by that statement.
It's a beautiful speech, and the whole thing's available. That is one of the few speeches I've mentioned before. I prefer to read most political speeches, but that's a speech that's very pleasant to listen to, and you can pull up on YouTube easily and watch that whole speech.
Right.
It's not very long. Maybe...
No, it is long. It's about 27 minutes.
Okay. All right.
So for a political speech, especially at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, right. We talk about
especially for this time.
Right. I mean, Lincoln
in the age of Twitter.
But Lincoln's Gettysburg was. I mean, what does 272 words actually take to say?
Yeah.
A little under a minute.
Funny little trivia thing about Lincoln at Gettysburg. First of all, it was very last minute. The organizers of the event decided to invite him. Hey, maybe we should have the president of the United States come, the commander in chief, right? And this is a big burial ground for dead soldiers during one of the most famous battles of the Civil War. And then he comes, and Edward Everett was the keynote speaker, and he spoke for something like 2.5 hours. Nobody, of course, remembered what he said. There was a photographer there, and we have one image of Lincoln, and it's him walking down the stairs with his head down, putting his hat on, because the photographer thought, oh, well, Lincoln's just getting started. I have, plenty of time to set the camera up. And I mean, Edward Everett just droned on for 2.5 hours. So he was just taking his sweet time, getting his camera in place. And all of a sudden he realized, oh, shoot, Lincoln's done. He's finished. And so he scrambled, and all we have is him walking down the steps after he's done.
He probably was wishing he had one of these modern point and shoot cameras or a little camera phone in his pocket.
Yeah.
We did talk about that, and I was wrong that the speech was not delivered at the Republican National Convention like I thought it was. And I'm going to go ahead. Well, I'm not. I want to take personal responsibility for this, right? I could go and blame this on my CU Boulder political science education, but let's not go there. That was my fault. I misunderstood. It was actually delivered on October 27th, 1964. It was that election cycle. It wasn't advocating for Barry Goldwater. I think it's an important conversation for us to have. Yeah. But it came about a week before the election,
the 64 presidential
election when Goldwater eventually lost to LBJ, and we'll get into that a little bit today.
Right.
The interesting thing is it's hard to argue it was 2 years later that he gets elected governor of California. I believe it was 66. I believe, and we can somebody else can fact check me on this one too.
Right.
But I believe his first elected office, whether that was governor of California, that was something different, was 66 in about 2 years following that speech.
I do know that 64 presidential election, my teacher, Professor Jaffa, and we're actually going to talk more about Jaffa today, he always used to like to connect himself to Ronald Reagan. In that 1964 election season was the first time that's when Reagan switched his party affiliation from Democrat to Republican. He had been a Democrat. He had been an FDR New Dealing Democrat, and so was Harry Jaffa. And both of them in that 64 campaign is when they switched from Democrat to Republican Party.
And it's hard to argue that might have been one of the most pivotal elections of the last 75 years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I was thinking about this. Sometimes in the quiet moments, your mind starts going to strange places. I am 52 years old right now, and I start thinking about the significance of of 52 years. And I was thinking of, so Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, first Republican elected president of the United States. What came 52 years later? Well, that would put you at 1912. That's the election of Woodrow Wilson, which is striking to me, right? Those two. Here's Lincoln on the one hand, doing everything that he can to preserve the principles of the American founding. Frequently going back to the Declaration of Independence. We were just talking about Gettysburg. I mean, his most famous speech ever. And how does he begin? 77 years ago. That's 87 years ago. If you go back, that was in 1863 when he said that. You end up at 1776, right? The Declaration of Independence. And the whole speech is about this great Civil War is a test whether this nation or any nation can remain dedicated to the proposition all men are created equal. That's Lincoln, elected in 1860. 52 years later, we get Democrat Woodrow Wilson,
right?
One of the leading progressives whose entire intellectual academic career really can be summed up as a critique and a rejection of the principles of the American founding.
Sure.
That's his main purpose, is to refound the United States on some kind of new model of scientific expertise rather than those natural right principles of self-government.
Sure.
If you continue running with that number 52, it gets even more interesting. So going back to Lincoln in 1860, 52 years prior would be 1808, which is the election of James Madison,
right?
Primary author of the United States Constitution, great critic, great combatant to Alexander Hamilton in the 1790s. That Hamilton play, by the way, my wife and I went and saw the musical live. It's here in Denver right now, and I actually I recommend it highly. It's fun. The talent on display is unbelievable. The singing and dancing and all of that, and the story they tell is historically correct. They do get it right. And so you have Madison, who is this fierce opponent to Hamilton in the 1790s, and a decade later, when Madison becomes president, he becomes a thoroughgoing Hamiltonian. It's James Madison, who earlier was pushing back against Hamilton's whole economic plan. Madison's the one who gives us the second bank of the United States,
right?
Which is a very Hamiltonian kind of institution. And then going back to our 52, so you have Madison in 1808, you have Lincoln getting elected in 1860, you have progressive Woodrow Wilson in 1912. 52 years after that lands us at 1964, which we were talking about last week. We're going to talk more about this week. Pivotal year in American history, in American politics, pivotal election. It's an election that we see an incumbent president, but under very unusual situation, Lyndon Johnson, who had been vice president to John F. Kennedy. And then upon Kennedy's assassination in 1963, LBJ becomes president. So he's actually running as the incumbent president, and he's being challenged by Republican Barry Goldwater. And then if you fast forward 52 years after that, you end up at that very boring, uninteresting, non-controversial election of 2016 and the election of Donald J. Trump. And you and I have talked about this. I mean, think of, from Trump back to LBJ to Lyndon Johnson to Lincoln to James Madison. It's hard to get five characters who are more different, who are each of them highly polarizing,
right?
In all kinds of ways.
That's the best word for it.
Even Lincoln. I mean, we have to call things as they are in the spirit of truth. I mean, today people want to rally around Lincoln as a great, the progressive term, leader and manager, and there's all kinds of books written about Lincoln as the model. Let's not forget, he also presided over a civil war.
Right.
He was sending Union armies into the field, right, to go shoot at fellow Americans. So in that sense, very controversial, very, very polarizing.
It's hard to argue that there might. I don't think you could argue that there is a more polarizing president during his time in office than Abraham Lincoln. I mean,
yeah,
as much as you and I adore him.
Well, I mean, some of his messages prior to being elected president, prior to the war, are eerily relevant to our circumstances today. In 1858, the Republican Party of Illinois nominated Lincoln to be their U.S. Senate candidate.
Mm-hmm.
That was in the summer. The state Republican Party had their convention in Illinois, and that's what sets up. So Lincoln is the Republican candidate, and he challenges the incumbent senator is Stephen A. Douglas,
right,
a Democrat, very influential, highly popular United States senator, and that's when we get those famous debates in the fall of 1858. That's a campaign for the United States Senate, and when the Republicans nominate Lincoln that summer in 1858, his acceptance speech now is, famed as one of his most famous speeches or renowned speeches, was incredibly controversial. The whole theme was a house divided.
Mm-hmm.
That we are a house divided against itself, using this ancient biblical metaphor. And Lincoln does say in that speech, he says, I don't think the house is going to fall. What I think is going to happen is it's going to cease to be divided. It's going to it's divided between freedom and slavery. There are people who think freedom is right, and there are people who think slavery is right. And these two positions are irreconcilable with each other. If one is correct, then the other has to be wrong. And his argument was, at some point, one way or another, we're going to stop being divided. America's either going to become all free, and there will be no more legalized slavery, or it's going to become all slave, and there will be no freedom under the law. And I worry that, we today in the United States, certainly our house is divided. There's no disputing that. And we're divided in very similar ways. There are those who want individual liberty. There are those who want to, use their property the way they want to use it, raise their children the way they want to raise it, take care of themselves the way they want. They want to govern themselves. They want self-government. And then there are large numbers of Americans today who want a class of experts to manage our lives and make our choices for us.
We're really at a point now where the difference is, do we want to reignite the idea of the American founding, the American idea, or do we want to move further into this idea of progressive central planning? And what's really interesting is all five of those guys, all five of those presidents who you mentioned, that was really the core of their role, either during their presidency or at some point in their political career, right? I mean, Madison was sitting there writing the Constitution as the guy saying, here's the idea, how do we codify it into law? And Lincoln saying, we codified it into law, but we're not living up to that law, and we're not enforcing that law properly. And I'm willing to fight a war to get us back in line with the ideas of the founding and the Constitution. Along comes Wilson and says, forget those laws. I'm gonna start advocating for this major change that leads us through the next 30 years with FDR, who starts to help change the Supreme Court in a way that now all of a sudden the law is interpreted completely differently than its original intent. You get all the way up to LBJ, who's saying, forget the law. I just want votes, and we're gonna change the country. We're gonna change the way everybody thinks. We're gonna change the way the government's role in society is gonna look.
Well, one of the interesting things you see in those three progressive presidents, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Johnson, and I think this is very emblematic of progressivism, unlike constitutionalists who really run on a platform of, I will be your constitutional servant. If you elect me, you, the people, are my masters, and I will do my best to uphold the oath to defend and protect the Constitution. The progressives, who care very little about the Constitution, in fact, they look at the Constitution as an obstacle. They look at the Constitution as a bad thing to be overcome or ignored or revised somehow. They always have these big programs So in the case of Woodrow Wilson, it was the new freedoms. We have these new that was his theme. In the case of Franklin Roosevelt, it's a new deal, a new agreement, a new arrangement, right? Not the old a deal of the founding, a new deal. In the case of Lyndon Johnson, it's a great society. We're going to build a great society, and the federal government is going to be at the center of that project, right? No mention about, I'm just a humble servant and I will exercise the few constitutional powers you, the people, have granted me. It's, we're going to build a shining, great society, and it's going to be governed by experts.
And you really do have it. It comes down to the vote of the people. I mean, we've talked about this in the past. There's a lot of questions about whether or not Lincoln would have been elected had the Democrats not fielded two candidates in 1860. And so when you're a progressive, and I know they weren't progressives yet in 1860, but the Democratic Party in 1860 was still promising, we'll just give you whatever you want, right? Their entire platform, I mean, whether it was popular sovereignty under Douglas or just slavery for all under the who was the Southern candidate?
That was the great that was the great divide, right? This is kind of a fascinating question about, and it helps you understand both American political history, American politics, but also it helps you understand the nature of the Democratic Party. So Stephen A. Douglas was the leading, he was a very prominent United States senator, more influential, more popular than the sitting president of the United States at that time, who was a Democrat named Buchanan. But Stephen Douglas had really inherited the reputation of one of the most prominent Whigs, Henry Clay.
Right.
Stephen A. Douglas had inherited that reputation, that mantle of Henry Clay, who had brokered all those famous compromises, including the famous compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. And late in his career, when Clay was failing to broker peace and compromises, it was Stephen A. Douglas who came along and stitched together an important compromise in 1850. He stitched together the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. He was a prominent guy. And when you ask the simple question, so in 1860, why did half of the Democratic Party reject Douglas? Why did they hate Douglas, right? Well, Douglas had dared to go out in public many times and say, slavery is neither right nor wrong. Right. There is no right or wrong about these things, if that sounds familiar to anybody, right? I mean, Douglas would be very popular today among progressives. Yeah. He was espousing a kind of moral relativism. There's no who's to say what's right or what's wrong. Different people have different perspectives. And so he was offering this idea of popular sovereignty. If people in one area want to have slavery, then by golly, they should have slavery. They should pass laws, for slavery. And if some other groups in other places want to prohibit slavery, let them prohibit slavery. Southern Democrats found that outrageous. Even the hint that it was okay for some people to prohibit slavery. They wanted a candidate that would stand up and say slavery is positively good, positively right. That divides the Democratic Party, and we end up with a minority candidate, a minority vote getter, Abraham Lincoln. And what I mean by that is he only got 39% of the popular vote. He did win a majority of electoral votes from northern states, but he was far, far short of a majority vote of the American people. And so, it just reveals much about the nature of, now that same Democratic Party is the Democratic Party that 52 years later will elect Woodrow Wilson. And 52 years later after that, Franklin Roosevelt. And after that, Lyndon Johnson. And, this is a subject for another discussion, and we're going to have other discussions about the accusation, the allegation that these parties switched somehow in the 1960s, which is utter nonsense. And it's utter nonsense based on Democrats themselves, what they're saying. They have their candidate sitting in the White House right now, President Joe Biden. How do Democrats describe Biden? As the heir to Franklin Roosevelt. He's the heir to Roosevelt. So what they're saying is there's this continuous line of progressive Democrats that goes from people like Woodrow Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt to Joe Biden sitting in the White House right now.
Right. And we can't forget about both LBJ and Jimmy Carter along the way.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard to ignore Barack Obama in that.
Right.
So what you saw, though, and the reason I brought up Lincoln being elected as a minority candidate in the way you described, the Democrats have really, since before Lincoln, their platform has been just tell the people what they want to hear to get elected. Mm-hmm. Because once we get power, we can do whatever we want. Yeah. We'll do what we want. We'll do what's best for them. And it was some form of progressivism or another. I think the only evolution that we saw in the late 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s was they started to say what they learned in Germany of, if we start bringing in scientists and we start telling you, it's not just us telling you we're smart and we know how to take care of you. Now we have scientists. We have experts who are ready to tell you what's best for you. And you're going to be taken care of in that sense. And every once in a while, they go too far with it. They've always gone too far with it. Right. But they go so far with it.
Politically, there's pushback. Right.
That eventually the people say, wait. Can't do this anymore. It's how you get the election of Ronald Reagan. It's how you get the election of Donald Trump. But there is this ongoing trend. And
well, in fact, it's how you get the conservative movement itself. Remember that. I mean, there was no serious opposition to Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, the man is elected 4 times in a row. This is unprecedented. Right. We end up passing an amendment to the Constitution just to make sure someone like that, can never hold office that many times again. So he had wide support. Now it's a complex story we can't get into right now. There's all kinds of cronyism and vote buying going on with those New Deal programs. But the bottom line is a lot of Americans are voting for Franklin Roosevelt, and that New Deal in the course of the 30s and the early years of the 1940s just grew exponentially. The federal government grew exponentially. These gigantic programs that all of a sudden were costing billions of dollars, which was unheard of. The federal bureaucracy grew and grew, and the creation of all kinds of new agencies and bureaus and commissions. Some Americans started to push back. They weren't really devoted constitutionalists. Many of them, in fact, were FDR New Dealers who thought the New Deal had just become excessive. It had become too much, too big, too expensive. It wasn't producing the results that they promised to produce. And among those people was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an FDR New Dealer, and he started questioning, this just doesn't seem right. And a number of other thinkers, this is how we get the emergence of the conservative movement in the late 1940s, the early 1950s. People start writing books, launching magazines, organizing what would later become think tanks, to push back against the excesses of the New Deal. And that story itself points to one of the great challenges, and that is the modern conservative movement from its origin was not a movement founded on the principles of the American founding or out of devotion to the Constitution or anything. It was a reaction against too much progressivism, but many of those early conservatives didn't really know what the alternative was. So they just knew that what they were seeing was big and bad.
It's really interesting because you're so spot on with that we did have this. These were progressives who were just saying these were right-leaning progressives who were just saying it's gotten too far, and we saw that again with Trump, right? We had a lot of people who came over and voted for Donald Trump. They weren't constitutionalists. They weren't sitting there saying, I just want this small constitutional government where it's not interfering and it's just there to protect my private property. They were saying, we still are a little bit progressive, but it's gone too far. And that's why things like the stimulus packages that he started putting out during COVID were so popular among so many of his voter base. They're still a little progressive. The government is still there to take care of me.
They have been drinking out of the wells of progressivism.
They don't know any different.
Yes.
And I think you're absolutely right. What we see is, and we talked last week a little bit about that myth of the party switch.
Right.
And you talked a lot about how the Democratic Party switched when LBJ said, we're going to use all these black people that we've been oppressing for all these years.
Right.
Now we're going to start offering them all these things, and they're going to be voting for us for the next 200 years.
And their oppression will now be an excuse to expand the power and control of the federal government over the property and businesses of Americans.
Exactly. And I think we made that point. I think we will continue to make that point. We will do some more on this myth of the party switch. There is another side to it, and that's the other side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle. Mm-hmm. That party did switch it shifted with the creation of the conservative movement in the same way you just brought up. That party went from the party of Lincoln, who is in favor of let's preserve, protect, and defend the founding of the United States, the American idea, to we might be a little progressive. We're not gonna offer an alternative to progressivism. We're just gonna say don't go too far.
Right.
And that was sort of a shift within that party. So both parties in the 1960s shifted, but they certainly didn't flip.
No, in fact, a couple of comments I want to make on some of the things you said regarding Trump and his supporters. You can see this in Trump himself, right? Trump himself never came out, never stood up in public and said, I have devoted myself to studying and understanding the principles of the American founding, and I am a student of those ideas, and that's my platform. That's right. No, it's questionable how much he actually understands about the founding. He came out with things like saying the swamp needs to be drained. The swamp is too big. Now, there's a very popular message. I actually wish he would have kept talking about that theme more as president. The swamp is too big. I agree, it's too big.
Didn't you write a book about that?
I wrote a book about that, right? But the point is, even hardcore progressive Democrats, some of them in their more honest moments will acknowledge, the swamp is really big and it's really bloated and it's really wasteful. And my point is, one does not need to be a devoted constitutionalist to see that there are huge problems with this big bloated federal bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. And so in that way, Trump as an individual candidate sort of reflects the challenge of the whole modern conservative movement. A bunch of sort of soft progressives pushing back against the excesses of progressivism, but not really knowing what the alternative is. In the case of the Republican Party, I would ask our listeners to think just for a moment, reflect on what that party was when Lincoln was elected. That party platform. And by the way, the platforms used back then used to be beautiful, short documents. Some of them, in some cases, 1 or 2 pages.
Right.
You can read it literally in like 4 or 5 minutes. I mean, they're short. I would encourage people to go back and look at the very first Republican platform was in 1856. The Republican candidate lost. The first successful one was in 1860. That's the one Lincoln ran on. Go look at those early Republican platforms, and what you will find is they open by citing the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and the whole party is devoted to preserving those principles and align American policies and practices with those principles. Fast forward to that election of 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt, he is challenging a sitting incumbent Republican president, Herbert Hoover, who's very much a progressive,
right?
Who very much is in favor of government spending, government programs. The big difference is Hoover wants to spend relatively small amounts of other people's money, and FDR wants to spend many more times other people's money. But in a sense, that's a kind of intra progressive fight there, and so you see that kind of internal morphing and transformation of the Republican Party between Lincoln and Hoover.
Just to throw out a note there for everybody to be aware of, and you correct me if I have the dates wrong.
Yeah.
But we talked about Lincoln being the minority elected candidate in 1860.
Yeah.
Similarly, and I don't know the exact percentages, but the Republican vote was heavily split when FDR was elected, because you had previous Republican and popular Republican Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Now running Blue Moose Party, running as
Bull Moose,
saying FDR isn't progressive enough. He doesn't want to spend enough of your...
No, that you're thinking of when TR was challenging Wilson.
Oh, was that Wilson? Okay,
Woodrow
that
Wilson.
is...
Yes.
I knew I had the dates wrong. But even still,
yes.
that was the start of that movement. I mean,
yes.
We still look at Wilson and say, Wilson kind of teed up FDR.
When I think of progressivism as a cultural and political phenomenon, in my mind, I imagine something like a huge tidal wave, like a huge tsunami coming. And progressivism hits the United States, hits the eastern coast, and then washes across the country. And there is virtually no resistance to it. I mean, it bends and washes over and transforms everything, including both major political parties,
right?
Institutions of higher education, churches. I mean, everything is transformed by this new progressive way of thinking. It's what makes someone like Calvin Coolidge truly, truly unique. There he stands in the 1920s, the heyday of progressivism, and he's a devoted student of the Declaration of Independence. He thinks those self-evident truths really are true. And he says in a famous speech that was actually given the 150th, what is that? The sesquicentennial, I believe, is the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, happens when Calvin Coolidge is president of the United States. And he gives a beautiful speech on the anniversary of the Declaration and points out that if those self-evident truths are true, and he thinks they are true, then there is no making progress beyond them. The only way you can move is backward. Historically, you can't go beyond the idea that all men are created equal, that every human being has an inherent rightful claim to their own life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. There is no making progress beyond that. There's just regress, going back and denying the rights of some people or violating the rights of some people.
We have a lot of members who are either running for or considering running for political office.
Yeah.
And I would strongly encourage people to go back and study the election of Calvin Coolidge, because what he did doesn't happen almost ever. He ran as a constitutionalist in an age of overwhelming progressive thought, and he won. You have Hoover, who ran as a really a progressive Republican, because that's what you had to do in order to win at that time. Nixon really was a progressive Republican, because you couldn't get elected as a constitutional at that time. And the proof of all of that is you had Barry Goldwater come along in 1964 trying to run on a very similar ticket to Calvin Coolidge, right? He was Barry Goldwater wanted to be the next Calvin Coolidge, and he lost. And he had great speeches, and he was everything that all the people who complain about Trump's personality, that Trump is boastful and abrasive and all of these things. Barry Goldwater was a politician. Yeah. Barry Goldwater knew how to shake hands and kiss babies and say all the right things, and was committed to the Constitution, and he lost. And we need to understand why. And if you are considering running for an office, if you're one of our members considering running for an office, and you actually want to change something, you actually want to do something that's not just be another progressive Republican in politics, which we have so many today.
Yes, we do.
That's why this term rhino that became popularized over the last 6 to 10 years, I don't know what that means anymore, because to me, a rhino is somebody who's a progressive running on a Republican ticket, right? If you're a Republican in name only, it means you're still a progressive, but you've abandoned the idea of what Lincoln defined the Republican Party as in 1860, what that page and a half document looked like, that platform looked like. I would challenge people, go back and study Coolidge. Figure out, how do you convince people that actually being a constitutionalist in an age of progressivism is a good thing?
Yeah, in fact, well, study both Coolidge and Barry Goldwater, because, I mean, you have the example of someone who wins, and you have the example of someone who doesn't. Both very smart men, both thoughtful students of the American founding, and both, Coolidge is running at a certain when progressivism it's the new thing. It is so attractive. It's still kind of pure, right? It doesn't have decades of crony corruption attached to it because it's relatively new. It's the science. It's the raging, popular trend in the universities and all of that. By the 1960s, right, the world is strikingly different, and progressivism has been around a lot, and there are a lot of progressive programs and promises that have never been fulfilled, that have progressive programs that had never come close to reaching the results. And look at how a constitutionalist like Barry Goldwater managed to lose to a rather unpopular and unlikable candidate, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And of course, during that campaign, so bringing us to that, we talked about that pivotal year of 1964 earlier, and we talked about last week. That's the year of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We were talking about public accommodations, and we can probably should revisit that subject. That passes. That had first been promoted by John F. Kennedy. JFK gets assassinated late in 1963. Mm-hmm. Johnson picks that idea up and continues to push it because now he thinks it's winning. I mean, for Johnson, this is simply about politics. Mm-hmm. If he can win by opposing a Civil Rights Act, then he's going to oppose it. If he can win by promoting a Civil Rights Act, he'll promote it. He thinks the cultural winds have changed and now are in favor of civil rights for Black Americans, and that's why he signs on to it.
It's hard to imagine that he probably didn't prefer opposing it, but was more interested in
winning.
In winning.
Yes. And that all happens in the early months of 1964. Barry Goldwater is a sitting United States senator from Arizona, and he opposes it. He votes no. He votes against it. To this day, sort of shallow-minded Americans who don't know much about history will slap the label of racist on Barry Goldwater and others like him, right, which is a terrible disservice. I'm confident there was not a racist bone in Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a devoted student of the Declaration of Independence and those ideas in it. He wanted equal protection of the law for the equal rights of every American citizen of all skin colors. He didn't care about that stuff. He didn't care about things like sexual preferences and orientation. He thought equal protection of the law for all citizens, period. And end of discussion. Mm-hmm. He was also a devoted constitutionalist, and he was acutely aware that the purpose of the Constitution is to limit the power of the federal government. And it enumerates a handful of rights and says, you in Congress, you have these powers and that's it. And when that 1964 civil rights legislation came along, Barry Goldwater was one of the few standing up saying, wait, this really isn't about civil rights. This is not about civil rights. This is creating an entirely new federal agency that's going to be called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. By the way, one of the men who would later run that is a guy named Clarence Thomas, who would have a famous hearing to become a Supreme Court justice and would be opposed by none other than Joe Biden, right? When you start connecting these dots, American history all of a sudden really gets scrunched. It seems pretty short, right? But Goldwater's point was, this isn't about civil rights. This isn't about, there are parts of it about voting, having access, right, to be able to go and vote unharmed, unmolested is the legal term, right? But these other parts of this legislation, this commanding businesses, who they have to do business with and who they have to hire and who they can't fire, and that's getting into how people use their own private property. That's not constitutional. And he's absolutely right about that. And for making that constitutional argument, and he greatly worried. He said, look, if we allow the federal government to cross this line and do this, what will we not allow them to do? Because they're exercising this power that is so blatantly there is no constitutional basis for the federal government to tell a private business owner they must trade goods or services with somebody. There's no power to do that. You could hear it dripping out of his speeches. He's sitting there worrying about things like, what's next? Are we going to let Congress get involved in health insurance and run health insurance? And of course, the answer is, yeah, it's exactly what's going to happen, right? Several decades later. And so Goldwater he was right to oppose the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and he paid a heavy price for it. I think that's a big part. It's not the only reason, but it's a big part of why he loses that presidential campaign. And forever after has been tarnished as a racist, which is, this is one of these things I want to make sure our members understand. There's nothing racist in offering a constitutional critique. In fact, even a moral critique of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I offer a constitutional critique and a moral critique. I think it's an immoral piece of legislation. I think that is unjust to command citizens what they must do with their own property. And there's nothing racist about that. And yet it's the only weapon that many progressives have. It's the only thing they can reach for, is to call someone a racist. Well, you must be a white supremacist if you disagree with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. No, I believe in freedom. And I want people to do with what is their own. There's another piece of that whole story, and it is this great misnomer. This is one of these big myths that persists. It's not true, but it's so pervasive in our culture today. And that is that Black Americans were helpless victims without the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Right. That they had nothing, they could do nothing, they simply suffered injustice and oppression, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then other kinds of legislation were needed and government programs to help pick them up. Mm-hmm. It's simply not true. Oh, there were horrific injustices going all the way back to slavery. Yeah. It involved horrific injustices. I've spent much of my career studying that terrible story of slavery. After slavery comes to an end, then you have the terrible, but then Democrats shift strategies. Rather than legalize slavery to control Black Americans, they launch domestic terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and others. At the state level, they start adopting Jim Crow laws where they pass laws saying a Black person can't use this restroom, or he can't ride on this train car, very, very ridiculous things like this. And was that hard? Was that terrible? Yes to all those things.
On that note, I think we've talked about this before. You talked about this last week, but I think we have to keep reinforcing and reminding everybody, they were using the power of government to do all of these things to oppress Black people in this country, right? This isn't just, okay, you're some domestic terrorist group who's breaking the law and saying, I dare you do. The Ku Klux Klan was running for sheriff, getting elected in every office in the state and in their cities and in their counties. They were running for offices and installing their people in government so that they could pass these Jim Crow laws, so that they could decide who they were going to prosecute, who they were not going to prosecute. It wasn't just like, okay, this is just some mob running around and the government was helpless.
And I want to put a sharp edge on your point and bring it up to more contemporary times. I think many people, when they hear Ku Klux Klan, they think, of these terrible things happening a long, long time ago, 100 years ago or more. Going back to 1964, when that civil rights legislation, I almost don't, that's its name. Yeah. So everyone calls it the 1964 Civil Rights Legislation. I would prefer something like the 1964 Government Expansion Act or something, because that's really what it is. Yes. When that piece of legislation was working its way through Congress, there was a famous filibuster in the Senate. And that filibuster was led by a guy named Robert Byrd, B-Y-R-D. Robert Byrd was a lifelong Democrat. If there was a party switch, no one gave the memo to Robert Byrd because he didn't switch affiliations. And this man, who was a sitting high-ranking United States senator, long time, one of the longest, I don't think he's the longest, but one of the longest serving members of the Senate. He was there for decades. He also had a career in the Ku Klux Klan. He was a high-ranking member got awards by the Ku Klux Klan. He didn't die until 2010.
Right.
That's not that long ago. Every one of our listeners remembers 2010. And when he died in 2010, you know who went and spoke at his funeral? Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, sitting president of the United States, Barack Obama, went and they were all fawning over this lifelong Democrat, Robert Byrd. But to your point, right, those Klan members weren't just some local ruffians and gangsters beating up people. No. They were influential people in positions of political power, including mayors and sheriffs and judges and United States senators.
To bring that full list full circle, Joe Biden spoke at Robert Byrd's funeral.
Yeah.
Joe Biden, most people called it the formal eulogy,
right,
although there were several speakers.
Right.
The official formal eulogy was delivered by Joe Biden, who called Robert Byrd a friend and mentor.
Right.
I mean, we are talking about the current president of the United States.
Right.
Sat down, it stood up in front of a room full of lifelong Washington insiders and said, this man, who was known as a major figure within the Ku Klux Klan, as a friend and a mentor.
And he, right, unlike Barry Goldwater, Byrd is pushing back against the Civil Rights Act because he's a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He hates black people.
Right.
Barry Goldwater, right, he has nothing in common with Barry Goldwater is pushing back against this legislation because he said this is a patently unconstitutional expansion of federal power. So there's this view that black people could do nothing, that they were helpless, that they were victims, and the truth is, during all those decades of terrible injustices, it turns out many black people, many black Americans were really thriving. They courageously stood up against the Ku Klux Klan and the terrorists, and they didn't just crumble. They went and they created businesses. It's a fascinating story in going back to the mid-1960s. So the next year after the Civil Rights Act, 1965, a prominent Democratic senator, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was also, he was a little unusual. He was also an academic. He had an academic career before going into politics. He was a PhD in sociology. And he had also worked for the federal government, I think in the Department of Labor, I believe.
It wasn't that he was different. He was just a little more old school. Because if we go back to like Woodrow Wilson, right?
Well, I mean, yes, that's true.
He is directly in the line of Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And he produces this report, and it's easily available on the internet. It was a report on, according to the title, a report on the Negro family, the status of family among black Americans. And the subtitle was something like an emergency call to action. At that time, illegitimacy rates, meaning children being born into homes where both the mother and the father were not present. One of them was missing. Typically, it was the father missing. Those rates were getting up in the 40 to 50% range. And Moynihan thought that's a disaster. That's a disaster to have 40% of black children being born without fathers around. This is going to lead to terrible things as those children become grown-ups without fathers. Of course, those numbers would skyrocket throughout the late 60s, the 70s. Eventually, they would reach near 100% in some inner city areas, where meaning near 100% of black children are being born without a father around. And in that report, Moynihan said the reason for broken families among black Americans ultimately is the legacy of slavery. Because in slavery, the families were matriarchal, the families of black slaves. Fathers were typically sold. This is Moynihan. Fathers were typically not present, and so boys grew up just knowing their mother, not experiencing having a father around, so they themselves never learned how to be fathers. So they weren't, and he says, and this problem just has perpetuated itself and gotten worse and worse, so that young black men don't know how to be fathers because they themselves never had fathers. And most people sort of said, okay, that makes sense. I buy into it. Except 10 years later, this sort of obscure historian, a guy named Herbert Gutman, he's studying that report. And he goes, I don't know that that's actually true.
Right.
Is that true? So he went and he assembles this incredible database of family life among blacks going all the way back prior to the American Revolution. He goes back into the 1740s, 1750s, and then throughout the founding period, throughout the 19th century, into the 20th century, into the whole period of the Great Depression and New Deal. And what he finds is it's both astounding and it's beautiful. Turns out black Americans suffering a living hell on earth, married, stay married, and raise their children at incredibly high rates, up in the high 90%. It was very unusual to find a family of black people, Americans with black skin, in any of those periods, in the 1850s, in the 1890s, in the 1920s, where both mothers and fathers were not present. And it turns out, so what were they doing? Well, they were raising their kids. Yeah. They were teaching their kids. They were raising their kids. We mentioned last week that great story. They team up with a businessman, Rosenwald. His first name, Julius Rosenwald, teams up with Booker T. Washington, and they go and they build thousands of schools, which by all accounts, hands down, universally, were excellent schools. They actually focused on things like reading and writing and arithmetic and behavior and self-control, self-government. These were prominent themes in those Rosenwald schools. And those black Americans who went through those schools then left, and they went out and they were incredibly productive. And they opened businesses, and they opened gas stations and restaurants and banks and hotels and clothing stores and all the rest. In some areas, like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it was known as the Black Wall Street because there was so much money concentrated in the black neighborhoods of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so through all that period, it's not that there was this widespread demand among black Americans for federal programs to give them affirmative action and to control business owners. None of that. All that blacks were asking for was really what every American used to want. They wanted to be secure in their individual liberty and their property. That's it. They just didn't want some democratic. They didn't want Robert Byrd showing up in the middle of the night with his stupid hood on, and his torch and his fellow Klansmen threatening and raping and murdering. And they wanted to be safe from that and just be safe in their homes and their businesses. And this is part of the ugly long story of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has not once in its long history, and pretty soon, we're coming up on the 200th anniversary. If you date it according to the first election of Andrew Jackson, right? That's 1828.
Oh, right.
So 2028 will be the 200th anniversary of the modern Democratic Party. That party has not one time ever stood on a platform or written a platform that said we are for the equal protection of the laws, for the equal individual rights of each and every citizen. Not one time. It has always been about we're either going to enslave black people, torture black people, assault them, threaten them, boss them, control them, or bribe them and use them as pawns and buy votes from them with special affirmative action policies and subsidies, and use black people as an excuse to expand federal control and power over all Americans.
There's two quick points I want to make on everything you just said.
Yeah.
And I know we're running short on time, but first on the Andrew Jackson standpoint, you have a lot of people today taking up the cause, and I guess this has been going on for 30 or 40 years, taking up the cause of the American Indian, right? And taking up the defense of the American Indian. We just saw, we're seeing football teams and baseball teams change their name and everything else.
Yep.
Let's remember, it was Andrew Jackson who sat and tore up the agreement that Thomas Jefferson signed with the 5 tribes that began negotiations with George Washington got finalized with Thomas Jefferson
as his Secretary of State.
Right. And then when he was president, ended up signing it into law. This agreement with the 5 tribes that was going to guarantee them equal protection of the law as citizens of the United States. It was the first Democrat president, right? So you want to go back before slavery ended and everything else, you can look at what the Democratic Party did to American Indians right there and then. The second thing is the Rosenwald Schools. Yeah. I talk about this with our members and friends and family quite a bit. As a member of the U.S. Jewish community, I take a lot of pride in the Rosenwald Schools. I think what they did, what he did was really incredible. And I have that conversation a lot.
To be clear, I don't know if we mentioned this or not, and I don't know if anybody cares, but it is true. So Julius Rosenwald was Jewish. Right. Booker T. Washington is this black man who is writing, and he's very active in the period immediately following the Civil War, and he's trying to inspire fellow blacks to rise up in a good way, meaning lift yourselves up, educate yourselves, learn things, be productive, create wealth. Right? Let's get going. Let's make the most of this freedom. And those two team up. Right. And that, I mean, what a incredible combination of talent.
And they team up in a private way without going out and saying, hey, government, give us all this money so we can go do something great.
They did not call for a federal Department of Education. No. They said, let's go work with people in areas who want schools for their kids.
So the most common question I get, if the Rosenwald Schools were so good and so successful and black families liked them so much, why'd they disappear? And the answer is pretty simple. The answer is government growth, the expansion of the bureaucratic state that allowed the government to start placing licensing and regulations on all of these schools and all of these things and all the aspects of everybody's life made it harder and harder and harder for the Rosenwald Schools to continue to operate. And eventually led to their demise where students couldn't get the education they were getting, and they began to integrate into public schools.
Dave, this in itself is probably the subject of either a longer podcast discussion or maybe a separate happy hour or something. One of the important lessons in politics is looking at the unintended consequences of legislation and policies. It happens all the time. One such case being the landmark Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. That decision, and we can't go into the details here, we don't have the time, it held that public schools could not segregate students based on race. You couldn't tell black kids to stay out of schools. You couldn't put them in a separate room or separate building or something like that. And most people look at that as just a great, tremendous victory all the way around for justice. And yet one of the consequences is it fuels the spread of taxpayer-funded public schools throughout the South, and that means increasingly growing numbers of black students leave the Rosenwald schools and end up into rather poor-performing traditional neighborhood public schools. One could certainly make an argument they were getting a much better education in the old Rosenwald schools than they were in the new, expanded neighborhood public schools. That's one of the consequences of Brown versus Board of Education.
Well, I think the theme of this entire conversation goes back to something might sound good, but if it's unconstitutional, it's unconstitutional for a reason. And we need to start thinking through the way Barry Goldwater did, the way we've talked about the 1964 Civil Rights Act or Brown versus Board of Education. Something might sound good on its face. Obama introduced a Jobs Act or Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, right? All of these things might sound good. There's usually unintended consequences, and we need to start thinking through those.
Those labels and titles, right, don't always mean what the thing actually is. And also to tie this back with the very beginning of our prior podcast, in terms of a real action item here, what does all this mean? Here's what it means. It means all the public accommodation laws, state-based, 45 states have public accommodation laws, all the way up to the granddaddy of them all, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title II, which is public accommodations. It's time for them to go. They shouldn't exist. And when these controversies crop up, when some little business owner, some private business owner says, I'm being asked to perform some service or make something, and I really don't want to do that. Don't turn those controversies into debates about religion or free speech that sidetracks the big central subject, which is, why is government in the business of commanding a property owner what to do with his own property?
Right.
That's what it should all be about. And the only real solution is getting rid of these public accommodation laws, and in many cases, the unelected bureaucrats. Like here in Colorado, we have a civil rights commission, right, which is a bunch of appointed, unelected bureaucrats who enforce these policies on private property owners.
Well, if we're going to continue to defend the American idea, to guard the American idea, we have to keep pushing back on these things and really be willing to take the risks that somebody like Goldwater was willing to in 1964.
That's right. In that spirit of Goldwater, no sumos custodes.
Until next time.